I'll introduce myself first. Is Mishimora Elaine Mary Line as Spanish Gaelic. Bhí mé gobar an seo mar tróí deire inán agus tá áthas an dain orm go bhfuil mé an seohanneamh chun na caintóirí a chur in Díobh. I'm Mary Line. I worked here as a guide a number of years, and it was a great privilege to work in the home of Daniel O'Connell, and I got great pleasure and knowledge in doing so. The topic for this session is South Kerry and the sea, and we have two very interesting speakers for this session. The sea is ever present, as you know, around South Kerry, and it's in the consciousness of the people of Ivra, and with fishing and boating are very relevant since the very early days when people first came here. Mary McGillicuddy is the first speaker, and I've known Mary for many years. When I worked previously in South Kerry Development Partnership, Mary at that stage was in CADE, the Kerry Action for Development Education, a post she held for 20 years. And we cooperated on some projects together in that field. Mary studied media in New York and later completed a BA in sociology, history. She also did a diploma in rural development in UCC. And she holds an MSc in Environmental and Development Education from London, South Bank University in London. In 2008, Mary was awarded an MA in Local History from University of Limerick, and the topic of our thesis was mackerel fishing by seine boats in southern Kerry, 1880 to the 1920s, with particular reference to the role of women. When she was a frequent visitor with her father, who came from Castle Cove, Mary noted old Lawrence pictures on the walls of hostelries and hotels, and all the folklore and stories was about the work of the men. So she noticed, though, that in the photographs, women were prominent as well, because they were doing the fish curing work. But there was very little known or spoken about them. So that was the basis of her thesis. And we'll get a chance to hear her now when I introduce just my second speaker. Our second speaker for the afternoon is Mr. Finbar Moore. Finbar is Senior Archaeologist at the National Monument Service, where he heads the Underwater Archaeology Unit, and this unit was set up in the year 2000. Finbar has contributed to research, international and EU documents. They include, his thesis incidentally was on Ogham stones, including Kerry. More recently then, he has been working on research together with colleagues elsewhere on the continental shelf with a view to looking at its impact, the changes with climate change and the effects in the sea. He has contributed to a research strategy, Land Beneath the Waves, Submerged Landscape and Sea Level Changes. Finbar's work has also featured on RTEs nationwide because they recovered cannons from a Spanish Armada boat up in Sligo. More recently then, he has published a booklet on excavations relating to Ardfert. I have now, with that introduction, I'll just introduce our first speaker again, Mary McGillicuddy. Thank you, Mary.
Is Mishimara Ligilicoda and Guramahaga. Thank you to the Marys, thank you to Maras, thank you to the organisers, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'll get straight in. I know we're tight on time. So, as long as the technology works, a lot of my presentation is visual. So I'll do acknowledgements and introduction, and then I'm going to cover a little bit about the seine fishing, and I presume that there's more knowledge in the room than I have, so I really look forward to the feedback and comments at question time or during the presentation. So, history can inform, empower and liberate, be inclusive to everyone and provide a recognizable and usable past for all, though this does not always occur. So the study explores aspects of fishing, roughly the 1880s and 1920s, salt-cured mackerel, a key export at the time, and a gender-specific focus on the role and function of females, because I just didn't find it otherwise when I looked in documentation. So Whelan, a historian, says marginalisation of women, they are often outside history. Androcentrism, these are anthropologists, they did study mostly in Scotland fishing, and found that the focus is often on the male. So often then they said that those who did mention them frequently relegated them to a passing comment, a paragraph, or a discrete section on the household and or the family. An Irish historian divides women's work into three categories, either in the labour market, at home, or housework. So recently more studies have been trying to fill in the gaps, but they do focus on the paid labour market, home-based industries, and unwaged domestic production, with few studies addressing the even more marginal area of seasonal employment, which is what these women worked at. So, scant documentation and the virtual historical invisibility of these female workers provided an opportunity to uncover bad shoes, to uncover the evidence of their presence. And the reason I first kind of focused on them, like Mary mentioned, was you'd go into maybe the Butler Arms or wherever and you'd see the old photos, and that intrigued me. So you can see there, that was Portmagee. And many of you would be familiar with them. Historians are used to reading against the grain, interpreting silences, and using ephemeral sources. So not getting too academic with the gender focus, but gender analysis can question and reassess dominant narratives and challenge long-standing myths. The construction of women by some versus their actual lived experience, which often isn't discussed. Primary and secondary sources were located and examined to see if and how they actually recorded the work of women within the context of the fishing. And I studied South Kerry and West Cork. I really didn't go into Dingle as such, into West Kerry, just kept it South and West Cork. But it did happen in Dingle as well. The region could be considered peripheral geographically, but it also gave a lot of access to trade routes, as we know, foreign markets in other countries. So my sources were various: Royal Irish Inspector of Fisheries, Congested Districts Board, census, papers, folklore, and then I interviewed some surviving people who remembered either working as children in the area or remembered their parents and that, some in South Kerry and some in West Cork. So that's a hard to see map of what sources and where they were. You'd see it better in the thesis. Shellfish, mollusks are one type of fish. You've got the seabed fish, and then mackerel is the pelagic or surface forming, and pilchards are also known as sardines. Until 1601, valuable income for Irish chieftains. So they're saying that they let the foreigners come in and take the fish even then, whatever about the Spanish now or anyone else. They were coming then. Colonization and innovation. Sailboats were introduced by the landlords. They were supposedly from Cornwall, so it was an innovation. It's not an indigenous craft as such. It was a modern innovation. The boats and supplies, you needed capital to make them, and then the fishing palace or curing house and employees to catch it and sell it on. And early on, say in Bantry places, they were doing this with pilchard sardines. O'Carroll states that 1625 to 1766 there were 7 proto-industrial fish curing houses around Bantry Harbour alone, an average of 10 women working to each man fishing. So the backup on the shore was vital. The first Earl of Cork set up curing stations in Baltimore for sardines in the 1600s. William Petty's estate bordered Kenmare River. He tried to develop the fisheries in the 1670s, and Beecher in Skibbereen. He kept the fisheries for indirect benefits, a source of employment and extra income for his tenants, for as much as it would be an employment to the people who otherwise would be troubled to pay their rent. Toby Barnard, I think, said that one. And then, as he said, there was no shortage of energetic and greedy landowners and merchants who planned fisheries to enrich themselves and anglicize the native Irish. The industry was part of a larger developing capitalistic economy, and fishing, that's now termed traditional, was actually an adaptive response to that changing and growing economy. Reynolds asserts that the British didn't It was a development that was constricted. They didn't provide adequate facilities for the Irish to own or compete with larger craft, and 19th century Scottish artisanal fisheries were managed in the same manner to protect the London companies and their more advanced fishing vessels. So industrial production under capitalism transformed the cities, the industrializing areas, and equally the powerful forces changed the lives of people in the supply zones of the world, and South Kerry and West Cork was supplying lots of fish for this period to people in industrialized America and England mostly, although it went to some parts of Europe as well. Post-famine, 1874, the number of fishing boats were reduced to nearly a third of what they'd been in 1846, and crews to less than a quarter. But then an exception can be in Baltimore and Kinsale. There was great work done after 1862, deep sea mackerel fishery. There's a Lady Burdett was involved in developing. Two main types of fishing. Offshore, summer crew followed the fishing out of an area, spending long periods away, when in the inshore the fishermen didn't have to travel far, which suited farmers. A seine crew, two open Carvel-built wooden boats, the larger one 25 to 35 feet, up to 12 oarsmen, double-banked oars, sat in a larger boat, a helmsman, a captain, and a hewer or fish spotter. So that's a drawing diagram. The second, the follower or follower, would carry the bulk of the catch. It carried a maximum of 6 oarsmen and a helmsman. Sometimes I've seen 12, sometimes I've seen 15 mentioned for a crew. You can correct me. Per se nets, the two boats, they throw the net out and then they pull. And the mind boggles how they pull those nets into these open boats, and the amount of fish they could catch at times. And of course, their clothing was not very waterproof. They had a tough time. And so this is Ilambui, Crew, West Cork. Almost every village in South Kerry and Beara Peninsula had a crew at the end of the 19th century. William Spotswood Green, who lived in Derrynane area, every woman, man and child is employed. I have known the difficulty sometimes to get labour. The countryside is swept. You could not get help sometimes to get through the amount of fish. And then in the congested district board, he was saying that there were Americans that gave a certain kind of technique, showed the locals, and they were questioning with the CDB whether or not the locals were capable of doing the work. And he said, yeah, they're quite able. Salt absorbs the internal moisture into the fish, and then when the fish is placed in the salty liquid water, it absorbs into the fill ash and is preserved. That's an interesting photo, an early one from Cape Clear. And 2 weeks later, the produce is repacked into funnel barrels, and brine liquid is topped up twice weekly until the barrels were sealed, when the consignment is shipped out. McCarthy's in Bearhaven, that's the mackerels, when they put the stencil on the top of the barrel. And then I just thank you to Michael O'Neill from Carsavine. He gave me an actual stencil that was in his house that belonged to great-grandmother, and I've taken a photo and I'll include that in the presentation next time round. It said O'Neill's fish. So in 1900 in Valencia, the Kerry newspaper, The Sentinel, mentioned that it was alive with the business and very good wages are paid to all employed in boxing and removing the fish to the railway. So as you know, the railway was functioning down here, and it would take everything off to England, for the most part London. 2 Norwegian barges have come with cargoes of ice. Valencia has established itself as a great fishing station. U.S. Consul General, industrial classes throughout America, principally those of European origin, are the chief consumers of imported cured fish. And then he says the mackerel is very much favoured. Irish mackerel featured in restaurants. Another photo of the fish curing, large amounts of salt needed, and the Coopers got great work. Cullen states that change for the better was evident in the 1890s. Cash incomes rose appreciably, deposits in post office savings banks in counties rising. 1880s to 1912. This is an interesting photo of West Cove. If you ever go down to the pier now, can you imagine the hustle and bustle that is quite different to what it is now. You can see the sailboats down in the water. There's lots of barrels, but it seems like a steamship at the background there as well. The social system and the local economy gave inhabitants a sense of self and identity, a way of life. They had a fishing and farming way of life. Pluri-activity is a term now used for diverse economic activities, and in this case on land and at sea. And then maybe craft production, where women and men engaged in a variety of production tasks. Gendered perceptions of power include considering women's role as producers and women's power in a household, and that period can't be considered the same as now. And in this photo, Kwinana, you can see children as well. There's a boy there in the background. So anyone who has any local memories, please volunteer. All information is welcome. Women's labour can make a direct productive contribution to fishing, or then it can help produce more children for the next generation, and then do things, special responsibilities to fill in the gap when men are away at sea. So they did more than the average. And then the roles for fish would be fish processing, selling, bookkeeping, bait digging, net mending, and the agricultural labour and domestic and emotional support. The division of male breadwinner and female homemaker is of little relevance in this context because the families are interdependent, the men and the women. Some areas male dominated, others carried out predominantly by women. So the women had more economic authority and a degree of personal autonomy. The CDB, Congested Districts Board, tried, like an early overseas development agency, tried to develop economies and areas that were underdeveloped. So their quote that took off one of their reports was, "Progress could only be achieved by training menfolk in improved methods of land cultivation and in coastal areas in fishing, and by assisting women in better standards of homekeeping." However, they did identify women in some cases as the more economic gender and used pre-existing mechanisms to enhance the role of women as breadwinners, basically in the fish processing, I'd say, and where they were paid fairly and directly for their labour. That's from Kira Branach and UL. The census is from 1871 to 1911. There were different categorizations of work, and many women were actually listed in the indefinite or non-productive class, whereas they were really producing and supporting, but their contribution was masked. And then seasonal work, census returns didn't really often record seasonal role of women, though men were listed the occupation of fishermen, even though it was only seasonal work. Versus Newfoundland, where the census did record all women as well as men involved either harvesting or curing, and they were about a third to almost 40% on the records. In the Royal Irish Inspectorate, yearly earnings from shore-based labour of males and females were listed for a few years, and the value of the exports, and then they stopped counting the women. They just didn't specify. So there's Portmagee again. That's outdoor. They didn't have any shelter as such. And there's in Kerry 1889 what women and men were listed for that year working. Ballinskellig, Carsaveen, Portmagee, Blanchett, and West Cove, and then West Cork, from Baltimore to Ballydonnegan, different places. There wasn't a woman, a girl, or a child in the island who couldn't earn something in those days, and there was often so much to do that the very fishermen themselves had to lend a helping hand. So they were coming back in the morning, maybe after being fishing all night, exhausted, and yet they couldn't go to bed. They sometimes had to be thrown into doing the curing as well. So Kwinana, again, a black and white photo. It was a boom period. It was short-lived. Vivian Pollock, a very knowledgeable researcher in the north of Ireland, who looks into mostly Donegal area in terms of more herring fishing, refers to women who gutted and packed as expert workers. They could work late into the nights, and the conditions were often basic to harsh. The splitters would be on one side of the table and got a slightly higher wage, and the gutters would take out the innards. So that's a makeshift area. West Cork. the gloves were worn on both hands, and just the only digit covered was the thumb, and the other part fingerless. And then they had to work very quickly. Witnessing the past through workers' memories, we learned to ask what roles family and gender relations played. Questions that business and economic history have tended to neglect. They were wonderful workers. They could work from 8 in the morning till 8 in the evening. Often, if they caught a lot of fish to split, they'd have a long, long day. They were the main workers. They were wonderful. They could split fish like one strip of the knife, and it was there. It's a woman I spoke to in Allihies. In Scotland, many females, according to these authors, made hidden contributions as carriers, sellers, and organisers, just as in here. And local and migratory workers, women from the outside the region, from other areas of Ireland and Scotland, were employed in the seasonal fish curing business. Like they came down from Donegal to West Cork, and I don't know about here. The Royal Irish Inspectorate again. An English buyer brought 9 women from the Isle of Man to cure fish. And then in O'Daly and Cork says herring girls were employed by fish merchants. They followed the fleet along the coast, gutting and salting the fish. So in Baltimore, the special chalets were built for their accommodation. And they'd have good fun. There was a hall in Baltimore where they had the dances every week as well. So these are 2 sites we wanted to look up more. The top one, Seaboard History, has a lot of good material on the Scottish. The other one is a film, but I can't show it due to copyright reasons and time. So if you're looking at women's role with a gender analysis, you can look at their lives as having separate, like the private and the public, the house and land and the sea, the house and the farm, looking at issues of power or powerlessness, or looking at different concepts of value and power, depending on often class and roles. The rural subsistence lifestyle offended many middle-class travellers, was indicative in their minds of a low state of civilization. It was unfeminine, it was unwomanly behaviour, contrasting starkly with that of the very comfortable society elites. It was probably scary for them to see if people were living in a less comfortable way, but the ideology of domesticity and separate spheres was of relevance to the middle classes and the landlord family cultures. One can wonder if did it impact negatively upon a small holding family's view of themselves or not. Sometimes maybe they felt judged, but at the same time they were living a different lifestyle. While women's role as workers contributing to the vitality of a farm was vital, in many cases their status was relatively low in many areas. Outsiders then and now could regard women's physical labour as demeaning when viewing it from a particular perspective or worldview, but the dignity of such endeavours was and often is still discounted. I know one woman was telling me very proudly when I spoke in West Cork of how her grandmother had bought beautiful furnishings for the house because she earned that money from doing the fish curing, and it improved their quality of life. The whole thing of earning money, the cash economy increasingly impinged upon a small holding barter-based livelihood, as many people lived in those days, and fishing and fish curing provided access to income, enabling an increased standard of living. The work of women had contributed to the survival of essentially a pre-modern community, but the change from subsistence to industrial was unavoidable. One quote there, as the reaping hook cannot compete with a modern corn-cutting machine, it is obvious that the sailing boat cannot remain as effective on the same fishing grounds when the steam or motor vessel appears. Dependence on rowing, sail, and then wind power was ended by the introduction of motors. Then there was a crash in the 30s, and then freezing as a process replaced salting. So salted fish trade was on its way out. Bell observes that women such as the Donegal migrant workers left to Scotland and the UK left in great numbers. One could look at, I know I'm rushing a little bit now, but in terms of did this work give them an opportunity to make money, and then did they decide they would move on and out because of the level of subsistence that was existing in rural areas, and they were moving to, of course, many of them moved to the industrializing urban areas, rejecting rural society. Shia Khan was saying it would sadden the person who had experience of that work if he were to visit the harbour today, like at West Cove. All the bustle of the activity is utterly gone. Nothing at all to be seen but the cold and empty quays. Reclaiming the past of Irish women and integrating that work into Irish history is a significant challenge. I like talking about this to kind of raise the awareness of it, and as I was saying to someone earlier, if there's any local heritage centre that wants to start maybe mentioning the seine fishing, male and females, and the role of women, it would be very valid for this area. And I think there's a little bit being done in West Cork as well. Contrasted with the work of men, women's roles as workers and income earners has not been given equal weight in official documents and subsequent accounts to date. It was identified by my research, it was very scarce. I was told by my supervisor doing the thesis, you won't find much on the women, and if I had researched something, say military or something, I'm sure I would have been, had a much thicker thesis and been given a lot more credit, I would say, in some ways. But I wanted to put them on the record, scarce and all as the material was. Their work contributed to the fish processing industry of the time and enabled them to earn a cash income. A fundamental task is retrieval of traces, rescuing of voices, and expansion of the archive. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary. That was very insightful, and it's evident that women played a very big part in the community and in society in South Kerry, and they had their own wealth to boot, so that gave them great influence in the household and in the community at that time. And Frank O'Leary I was talking to at the break, and he mentioned that some of the fish from this area was going out to Texas and Barbados, and a whole lot of other places benefited from the fishing that was done here and all the hard work. Our next speaker now, as I said before, is Mr. Finbar Moore. He's an archaeologist underwater, so he's been down in those deep, dark depths of the ocean. So I'm really interested in hearing about the finds in the southwest. Thank you. We'll just try and keep the speakers, which who have been very good, to the time, and there'll be a slight delay, as you can imagine, in lunch, we'll take just a few questions at the end for both speakers. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks to Morris and to Mary and the committee for inviting me here to give a talk today on this subject of underwater archaeology, which is a relatively new area of study in the broader archaeological world. Just to say, I've been coming here for over 30 years, initially, as Mary said, to study the Ogham stones of the area, and hence I have a photograph of an Ogham stone at Kilogrone, not too far from Tirrawile, where Daniel O'Connell himself is supposed to have rested when he was out hunting at this time of year at that particular stone, in a very early form of the Irish language, so one didn't even try to interpret it or speak to it, but that's a very evocative place. When you go there, it probably hasn't changed a bit since his time. My other introduction to Daniel O'Connell was a first-year student in UCD under Kevin B. Nolan, who had written on the subject. My first essay was on Daniel O'Connell, so I don't know, I think I got a reasonable mark on it, I don't know, but anyway, that was a long time ago. So just to move on quickly, because I know time is short, just a quick introduction to who we are in the National Monument Service and in where the Underwater Archaeology Unit fits into that. So the National Monument Service has a number of units dealing with the Archaeological Survey of Ireland, which has been ongoing for about 50 years, conservation of national monuments, including Derryland here, etc., and then dealing with impacts or threats to monuments, regulating activities at archaeological sites, publication on surveys, and underwater archaeology has come in there the last 20 years. And impacts of climate change are definitely a very big area of concern at the moment in terms of the archaeological heritage generally. So our unit, the underwater unit, was set up initially as a pilot study in 1997 under Dr. Colin Breen, and then ultimately in-house in 2000 with two of my colleagues who are still with us, Carl Brady and Connie Keller. And we have a fairly wide brief dealing with building up information on wrecks and what we know about the wrecks that went down around the coast from documentary sources. And very little had been done in that up until the National Monuments Act changed in 1987 to protect shipwrecks. Wrecks over 100 years old underwater were automatically protected, and diving on them regulated, and archaeological objects underwater. And reporting of new discoveries of wrecks over 100 years or archaeological objects to the National Monument Service or the National Museum was part of that new legislation. So we had new legislation, but we didn't really know fully what we were protecting, so we had to develop a program of research and study to compile what we could from existing documentary sources like Lloyd's List, state papers, or older sources. And over the last 20 years, we built up an archive of 18,000 shipwrecks. So that's just summarising what I've said there on the protection of wrecks under the National Monuments Act. So we have now what we call the Wreck Inventory of Ireland database, and this map shows you the number of wrecks, a distribution map showing the concentrations of wrecks around the coast on Ireland's designated area of the Continental Shelf under the Continental Shelf Act. And so we have at the moment 18,500 entries for shipwrecks. I said a lot of those, and I'll give you some figures later, but a lot of those will be 18th, 19th century, and we brought it up to 1945 to incorporate the two world wars. So that's an ongoing study. We still haven't exhausted the sources by any means, but that gives you an idea of the maritime activity around our coast over the centuries. And if that's what we have on record, there's probably twice as much as that again that was never recorded. So that's the GIS mapping project. And we've recently launched, back in April of last year, what we call a Wreck Viewer, which is an interactive GIS-based, publicly available search facility, so that you can click on any wreck, and if there's known information on it, that will come up. As I said, we have 4,000 locations recorded of the 8 and 14,000 that we don't, but there's a link to the 14,000 that we don't have exact locations for, only general locations. So, for example, this is just an example. You can search it for various types of wrecks or ships as well. So this is just one for barques off Lost of Ireland, and the blue dots represent where we have information on wrecks of that type. And the website, the National Monuments.ie website, when you go into the Wreck Viewer and that, you get different layers of mapping as well, and that will give you the location, and you can click on the wreck and look at your own area. That's just one of the great examples of Trinidad Vallecera, excavated by Colin Martin off Donegal about 50 years ago, 50 years ago now, yes, yeah, and he's still going strong. You can click on the dot and it'll bring up the story of the wreck and so on. And then there's a link to the database and you can get a more detailed description. We also have a role in terms of protecting wrecks and dealing with impacts from treasure hunters, etc. And this is just one example that I thought might be nice. It's not Kerry, but it's sort of relevant. This is at the Worley Bay in West Cork, and there was an attempt to retrieve material off that back about 15 years ago, and by some local divers. They were thought it was a slave ship called the Amity, and they were looking for beads that would have been used in the slave trade. So, but they left some guns behind them on the foreshore, which some other characters came along to try and pick up for themselves. And at that stage, the game was up, and we were brought in, and there was a whole legal process went through, and we were asked to investigate it. And judging by the guns, and we couldn't get a dating for the timber in the tree ring chronology that's been built up by the radiocarbon, or the Dendrochronology Radiocarbon Lab in Belfast, we came to the conclusion that it was the guns, early 17th century, iron guns, when iron was replacing bronze as a means of, as a more popular type of gun, and fitting into that period was the the rover, the pirate slaver, one of the pirate slavers that was recorded as wrecked in Dunworthy Bay in 1631 as part of the fleet of Algerian ships that came to take slaves from Baltimore and other parts of the west coast of Ireland, no doubt, where it hasn't really been recorded because the Algerian pirates got as far as Iceland. So we think we might have one of those. So possibly there could be ships like that or wrecks like that off the coast of Kerry. So wrecks off the Kerry coast. We have 860 entries in the Wreck Inventory of Ireland database. That's about 5% of the known wrecks in Irish waters. Only 10 to 15% located, and the concentrations, as you'd expect, around the ports, Tralee, Dingle, and then major hazards like the Skelligs are off Valentia and the Blaskets, and over 100 recorded for Dingle and the Secloges, and other concentrations, Ballyhigh, Banna and Ballyskelligs. And every type of vessel I'm not going to read them all out there because I don't have time, and you can see every type of vessel is recorded having gone down off the Kerry coast. And the oldest were probably represented by logboats, and we have a database, we have about 200 logboats recorded from Ireland. My colleague Carl Brady has done a lot of work on that, especially following discoveries recently on Lough Corrib. But our logboats from Kerry, from the River Cashel, Brackenfield, and another found in Ballinclemsig. So logboats were the earliest probably means of transport on the rivers and lakes in this area, but no doubt more sophisticated boats were used, going right back to the Bronze Age, right back into prehistory, right through early history, because West Kerry, Southwest Kerry wasn't an isolated area. It was, there was, as you all know, a lot of you would know about the copper mines at Ross Island, and then you have the prehistoric settlement as evidence in the wedge tombs in this peninsula and the standing stones and stone circles, all tying with the material culture of northwestern Europe generally. So it's not an isolated area, and probably shipwrecks going back that far. So the earliest wreck that we have in our inventory is, from recorded sources, is probably that one lost at Scariff Island near Derrynane here in 1379. And as I said earlier, most wrecks are later in date. So that just gives you an overview of the wrecks in this particular, off the southwest coast and in the ports and harbours. And again, you can go into our wreck viewer and you can pick any of these dots and find one of the wrecks off this particular area of the coast. So I won't go into any great detail on that, only to highlight one or two that might be of interest. The earliest wreck in Kerry, from our research, I won't put the correction on that, but this is an unusual one, dating back to the 14th century. A Cornish expedition in the reign of Richard II had reinforcements at Southampton to be taken to Brittany. And this is amazing because the force, they'd seized nuns from a convent where some of the troops had been camped, so they weren't exactly gentlemen. And the commanders were John Arundel and others, and other knights. And they got into a fierce storm. It reminds me in a way of the Fastnet disaster about 40 years ago. The ships were carried off the Irish coast by gales, and 60 nuns were thrown overboard a castleboard to light the ship. So it was under rust. It struck rocks between the island, that's Scariff Island, and the mainland, and 25 other ships of that fleet were lost. And English contemporary accounts mention Sherkin, Cape Clear as the location of the island where the wrecks occurred, but Irish sources mention Scariff. And then we have another interesting wreck off Kerry. This one is off in Smerwick, so it's a bit further, technically southwest, I suppose. It's West Kerry anyway. And October 1578, one of Martin Frobisher's fleet at Coosball Cove in the west side of Smerwick Harbour. She was part of the expedition to exploit minerals in North Canada, and especially what they thought was gold on Baffin Island. And the vessel, under command of Richard Newton, became separated from the fleet, driven up and down the Irish coast for 6 to 7 weeks before it was beached in the shallows of the west coast of Smerwick. We don't have that wreck. We dived to Smerwick recently thinking there was a wreck that looked likely in the right spot, but it turned out to be an old fishing boat. But anyway, hundreds of tons of ore was uploaded and transferred to Dingle. Proved worthless, it was largely pyrite-based rock, and 8 tons were transferred to Doonanore, the location of the Great Massacre in 1579. And the ship was beyond repair and it was abandoned. And Frobisher had made a number of trips to Canada. He was a favourite of Elizabeth I. when he first brought this gold back to London, everybody celebrated this, but then it soon became apparent that these and he made a number of expeditions, that this was all fool's gold. So wonder, is that the gold that the streets of London were supposed to be paved with? But we'll see. And then, more locally again, Derrynane House, the O'Connells. Well, the O'Connells, back to hunting Captain Morgan and Leeds and their ancestors before them, back to the building of this house. What was it built on? What money? Probably their fishing, trading and smuggling interests were a major element of them having the resources to do what they did. And we have evidence for a shipwreck here in Derrynane Harbour, probably dating to the 18th century, probably back to the time of hunting Cap himself. And it was discovered by the Inverskeane Sabaka Club here in Derrynane, led by Andrew Toma, back over 20 years ago. And then a group called the Irish Underwater Archaeological Research Team, who were a team of amateur enthusiasts for developing archaeological techniques, investigated it. So it's there off Lamb Island, and you can see the slip just at the top part of the map there, and probably coming in on the wrong route. It should have been the straight line there, but it came in by the rocks and clearly came to an untimely end. And this is just a sketch plan done over 20 years ago by the group for Underwater Archaeological Research Team. And so 2 anchors, 6 cannon were recorded there. And the cannon are iron cannon, but they're 2 smaller carronades. The others are cannons. The 4 cannons could date anywhere from the 17th century to the 19th century almost, but the 2 carronades started coming in towards the middle of the 18th century, right around the time, and between that and the end of the 18th century. So they are more than likely date this ship to somewhere between 1750 and 1800. So it suggests again that it was tied in with the O'Connells and their smuggling in the area. So that's just an overview showing the guns and the anchors and the spread of material. There's a lot more work to be done on that wreck, and Andrew has been plaguing us for years to get back there and do a proper survey and recording of it, and maybe inspired by the summer school, I might try and get funding for that if the powers that be will let me. Other studies have been done in this area. My colleague Connie Kelleher has done a lot of work on piracy in the area and identifying sort of smugglers' steps, for want of a better word. These are the mast steps overlooking Derrynane Harbour, but they may well have been used in smuggling goods, and there are lots of these so-called pirate or smuggling steps around the coast of West Kerry, South Kerry and Cork. And pirates, this was a well-known 17th century pirate, Robert Nutt, based himself in Pallins, and liaised with the sheriff, and no doubt all sorts of nefarious deeds were concocted up between them. He had the St. Jack of Madeira, which was taken on 20th of October this is an account from the High Court of Admiralty, and by one Captain Nutless Company, Englishman, as she was returning from St. Thomas, he was lading of sugar, and then it was later separated from Nutt's man of war, but into Ballinskelligs in the night foul weather, and there the shipment's cargo were delivered to the Vice Admiral, Captain Thomas Harris. And another pirate, Captain Thomas, took the shipment's cargo from the Vice Admiral and took it to Berehaven. So that just gives you a sense of the kind of activity going right back to the 17th century. Especially early 17th century in this area was a hive of piracy, which kind of was ultimately suppressed come the middle of the 17th century. The Lady Nelson went down off the Skelligs in 1809 with great loss of life, and that has been dived as well by the underwater unit many years ago. Just a short plan of that. It lies at 32 metres. It's a difficult dive and a large sailing vessel, and more cannon and anchors. But it's a tricky one. Just a few short dives have been done on it recently. But just to move on, other ships of a later period, moving on to the 19th and 20th century. This one is in Tralee Bay, actually, the Manchester merchant caught fire. It was bringing a cargo of cotton back from India, of all places. So it was no loss of life, but it's in Tralee Bay. And the reason I'm putting it up here is because we've been lasing closely of late with the National Seabed Survey and the inshore version phase of that, which is ongoing, and they're using multi-beam sonar technology to map the seabed. But as incidental to that are the recording of shipwrecks that they come across, and a lot of the later ones, late 19th, early 20th century ones, stand proud of the seabed, so they're easy for them to pick up, like this one, the Manchester Merchant. And that gives you an indication of the kind of survey work they've been able to do and how much that increases our understanding of what's on the seabed and being able to engage with it. So that was it. It spontaneously ignited with the vessel subsequently catching fire as it neared the southwest of Ireland. But they've recorded hundreds of wrecks to that standard, and we have been supplying information as far as we can from our sources about them. So, and then World War I, World War II wrecks off Ireland, particularly World War I, over 1,000 wrecks off World War I, and there's 1915, Germany commencing unrestricted submarine campaign, waters around Ireland, and Britain declared war zone, and blockade of the German fleet trying to blockade that of Denmark, and then you have submarine attacks from the U-boats off Ireland, and effectively the Western Front came to the west coast of Ireland because you had over 1,000 ships lost off Ireland, 1,053, and you can see in 1917 there were phases of unrestricted warfare, and then the Germans backed off, and then 1917 unrestricted warfare again, which was the ultimate cause of America coming to the First World War. You see they're all various nationalities of vessels and types of vessels, from cruisers, dreadnoughts to trawlers and others. And of course the one that's everyone is aware of is the Lusitania, sunk in 1915. Didn't quite bring America into the war, but did raise a lot of anti-German sentiment around the world. So these are just some of the discoveries made around the coast by the National Seabed Survey. This one, the SS Calcas off the southwest Kerry coast here, attacked without warning by U-80, 28 kilometres off the southwest coast here, of Carzavine, in fact, yeah. So again, just showing how close the war came, how people were visibly able to stand on the shore and watch the submarines and the ships go by, and in some instances see them go down, like the Lusitania classically. That's the Calcas under tow after it was hit. Climate change, just mentioned at Ross Bay Beach, not too far from here, an iconic wreck called the Sunbeam, a schooner that beached in 1904 and then gradually disintegrated over time, and it became something of a feature of the beach, and people walking in and built up a sort of a connection with it and the story of it. And then, so it sits there for 100 years, gradually deteriorating, and then major storms in 2014. Coming in off the southwest, and it was carried about 100 metres up the beach, and then this is it after the storms hit, and so it just shows the massive impact of the sea and how it's increasing all the time. So that's it again, just showing how smashed up it was. So it was literally lifted out of the sand, we commissioned a company, Actra Archaeology under Lardon, to develop a system to protect it. We put tons of sandbags in and cordoned it off and did everything, and then next storm, and it totally disintegrated. I've maybe 5 minutes. I'll give you a quick overview of some of our dive projects, just to give you a sense again of who we are and what we're at. Mary mentioned the Spantromata guns that we raised last year off Streeter. Now we have off Kerry 2 definite one Spantromata wrecks in Velasquez Sound, the Santa Maria de la Rosa and the San Juan Fernando Hora, both of which went down in September 1588. And there's possibly another one here off Ballinskelligs as well, but we don't have a name for it. And most of you would be very familiar with the conflict between Elizabeth and Philip of Spain and which I won't go into in any detail, other than that it led to Spain sending around 100 Turkish ships with a view to conquering England, of course, and not exactly having a very successful outcome, driven after Battle of Calais and Gravelines up through the Orkneys and Shetlands around the west coast, and 25 or 6 of them came to grief off the west coast of Ireland, including the Santa Maria de la Rosa there off Kerry, and it was investigated. It was investigated, as I said, by Sidney Wignall and with the aid of Colin Martin and Des Brannigan, the renowned and irrepressible Des, who sadly died only a year or two ago. But this is September 1588. The English are already recording the total number of ships and considering whether this is another invasion or whether, and also introducing a reign of terror, if you like, in Ireland in relation to anyone who might give succour or help to the Spanish survivors. And as Declan Downey, I think, who's here, has said that this was the real beginning of the 9 Years' War, when the likes of O'Rourke, Breffni and McClancy lost their lives for giving help to the Spaniards. But you can see in Munster, you've got in the Shannon, in Tralee, in Dingle, in Desmond, which were in and of the Shannon ships of the Armada. And Santa Maria della Rosa, some of the material from that is in the Ulster Museum or the Tar Museum in Derry. And then that's just a contemporary account showing the Santa Maria della Rosa going down, with Juan Martinez Recalde was at the helm on one of the other ships in the harbour there, and the what would have been considered the illegitimate son of the King of Spain drowned, plus with 500 others, and one boy survived. Colin Martin, who was there and still comes back every so often to share his knowledge with us. The one up in Sligo, the Juliana, was the one we investigated at True Wrecks of it down off Sligo. It was a merchantman built in Spain near Barcelona on the work applied the route from Barcelona to Naples to Sicily and so on. It was commandeered by Philip. It saw action at the Battle of Lepanto as a supply ship. It was at Terceira in the Azores when Spain fully conquered Portugal, and it was at the Battle of Lisbon as well prior to that. And but it wasn't able for the west coast of Ireland in 1588. First discovered 30 years ago by a group of English divers. Long court case ensued. Rediscovery in 2015 when after winter storms, cannon, anchors, carriage wheels, etc. And this is a plan, an amalgamated plan of what was done 30 years ago, but we did 9 carriage wheels. There's 12 cannon from it now, and a lot of the structural elements of the lower hull are intact. Just to give you a sense of what might be off West Kerry as well, the Santa Maria della Rosa hasn't really been explored that well, but that could be, this could be the kind of material that's sitting off the shore here as well. These were beautifully decorated bronze cannon with depictions of saints, most of whom were martyrs, and they were just the date of 1570, which is the date of construction of the ship as a merchant vessel. So obviously they were invoking the power of the martyrs to help them on their trade routes in the Mediterranean and threats from Algerian pirates, etc., similar to the threats that were off our shore not so long after. So these are the saints: St. Rocco, John the Baptist, Hilaria, Sebastian, and St. Peter. This one is Sicilian, and the other martyr, the other guns are from Genoa. We actually know who the gun founders were. So that's Peter looking heavenward. And we even, there's one gun with an Arabic inscription on it made by Master Mustafa. It was a gun found in Constantinople in the late 16th century. So possible a trophy from Lepanto. So you don't know what you're going to get when you go excavating an archaeological site. So this is just to give you a sense of what we record in the day-to-day job. You go out, you look at this foreshore, and you can see wrecks, and you might say, oh, it just won't tell you anything, but you can if you get proper samples, you can date them, and then by planning them, you can reconstruct what they might have looked like, and you can build up a picture of what the ships that were sunk off our coast might look like, and even stray bits of timber like that are something we'd be looking at. So, legal protection doesn't always protect these sites. There is increased salvage and huge, better technology now for treasure hunters, etc., going after treasure. We have to deal with wrecks that would have foreign flag state claims on them, and then, as I said, the impacts of climate change, etc. And there is a convention on protecting underwater cultural heritage under UNESCO, which Ireland hopes to ratify when new legislation comes in, new national monuments legislation comes in. So that's basically it, a quick overview of what we do with some of the wrecks off Kerry, and thank you.
I think we're very privileged to have heard such wonderful speakers this afternoon, Mary and Finbar. And I hope that the government will give lots of money to the National Monument Service so that they continue the good work, especially if there are so much to discover still. So take one or two questions, just that's all we have time for, I'd say, because we're trying to keep to schedule. So there's one down there.
Thank you. A question from Mary, and it's this: did any historian, male or female, contemporary historian, examine the lives of the Pilcher, the women in that? I'm thinking of Charlotte Grace O'Brien, who took an interest in the female emigrants from Cove to New York, you know. So was there anybody like her doing?
There's a Vivian Pollock, P-O-L-L-O-C-K, same as the fish, and she's done quite a bit on More Donegal. Yeah, that's the only one that comes to mind about Ireland, but I could be wrong. Yeah.
Neil Fenton, just one quick question for Finbar. I know this is a complex question, so I'd appreciate a simplistic answer. What is the legal position regarding the ownership of salvage off the coast of Ireland, and at what point does it become the ownership of the state?
All right, yes, yeah, well, it's interesting. We have a former director of the National Museum here who's probably would be essential to the answer to that question in this day. The law, as it stands, protects all wrecks over 100 years old. That means you have to have a license to dive in them or to carry out any activities. In terms of ownership, some wrecks have owners. They could be British Ministry of Defence, they could be the Department of Transport in Britain, they could be private owners, like the Lusitania as a private owner. Where there is no, and that has to be respected. And what you do then is you would liaise with those people with a view, if they're of significant historical or archaeological importance, you hope to liaise with either of those owners to protect those wrecks, or if any recoveries were to be made, then we've done to the best standards of underwater archaeological practice. So if there's a known owner, if a wreck is found, it's over 100 years old, or if a wreck is less than 100 years old, there's no known owner, and that is established. And that's established under different legislation. There is the Merchant Shipping Salvage Wreck Act of 1993. And under that act, the receiver of wreck, and Ireland has a number of receivers around the coast, the UK is one receiver, but the receiver of wreck for the relevant part of the coast, if material is landed on our shore, from a wreck off our shore, and someone's claiming salvage rights over it, they have to hang that material up to the receiver of wreck. The receiver of wreck then will do a search. He will contact all the people, relevant stakeholders, the people. He'll advertise as well the fact that this material has been recovered, and also contact people that he feels should be contacted. Could be the director of the National Museum, and if the wreck itself, under the Act, the National Monument Service is supposed to be informed. But in the absence then, if after a year and a day no owner comes forward, then the director of the National Museum can claim that material on behalf of the state. If he claims the material on behalf of the state, he has to weigh up whether he really thinks it's going to add to the national collection, because there's a cost involved, and the cost is paying the salver. The salver's costs very often are a percentage of the cost for recovering the material, and that's essentially it. Ireland the Irish law protecting wrecks is very strong in the 12-mile territorial seas. For the contiguous zone out to 24 miles, not so strong. And then on the continental shelf, although our National Monuments Act protects wrecks on Ireland's designated area of the continental shelf, the International of the Sea doesn't recognise individual states' rights over cultural heritage on the seabed, on their areas of the continental shelf. So our legislation is somewhat in conflict with the legislation, international legislation. So if someone's operating 40, 50 miles off our shore on a significantly historical wreck, we don't have a lot of muscle in that regard in terms of regulating or requiring them to observe best practice, unless they land the material on our shores and claim salvage rights. Then the receiver wreck kicks in again. And we've had a number of cases like that, where people have been claiming to go after World War I or World War II wrecks, are supposedly carrying gold, wanting to investigate them, and the Empire Heritage being one recently. And it raised those questions about how far Ireland will go and protect a wreck like that. And it's really only through international cooperation that you can really protect them. And that's where the UNESCO Convention comes in. And not some of the bigger powers haven't signed up to that, like America and the UK, because they're protecting their own interests. A lot of other countries have, France, Spain, Germany, etc. Over 40 countries have signed that now. We haven't. But really, in the international waters, I think it's international cooperation, identifying wrecks that are so important that they shouldn't be subject to just wholesale salvage. But that's something that's still in the early days of being developed and worked out, you know. And now you've got the technology is improving all the time, so more salvage companies are coming into the business. So it puts more pressure on individual coastal states and flag states being the ones that might claim ownership, to work together to see what they can do to protect the heritage, you know, underwater.
Hello, we have a question in the marquee.
Just to endorse the comments of Mary Lyons, we were indeed privileged this morning to hear the two speakers, but one question for Mary McGillicuddy. We know that there were some terrible tragedies at sea in the seine boats when they were fishing, but did you come across any instance of tragedies on shore? Because the women worked very near the shore, and particularly in the early days, and there are some stories going that a number of women were drowned or were pulled into the sea because they were working too close to the shore. Did you come across any?
No, I didn't come across anything that I can recall, but I'd love to hear from you. I can't see you, you're obviously in the other tent, so if you make me off later, I'd love to find out what you know, because I'm constantly just trying to glean more, and so I can't remember. I do remember coming across one woman who owned a boat and was listed as a fisherwoman in Waterford, I think, but I didn't come across any tragedies.
Thank you.
Cheers.
We'll just take one more. I think Lady Dunraven has a question. So, yeah, just hold on 1 second. Do you want to ask a question?
Excuse me, thank you. I came to live in this area in 1969, and there was sailboat racing out of Derrynane Harbour, which still goes on occasion.
Yeah.
The second thing I wanted to say to you was my father-in-law, my husband's father, built a sort of harbour cave within Lamb Island to store lobsters. It got blown inside out in 1947 by a huge storm. But he packed the lobsters from here. They were taken out to Shannon. They were put in ice and they were served for lunch in Paris.
Oh God, there's wonderful stories out there. Yeah.
I mean, I didn't believe it, but I was told it was actually true.
Yeah, and I won't go on too much, but I know a cousin talking about they were fishing for shark to get the oil out of the sharks. That was what was fueling the lighthouses up until the 50s, I think. And I know my father said they fish lobster, crab, and other fish, and then it would end up in Billingsgate in London. So, you know, they were very clued in and connected to the wider world. Yeah. So on the plane. Yeah. So anyone who's interested in heritage and wants to develop the maritime heritage of the area a bit more, let's maybe South Kerry Partnership will help. Who knows?
So I'm sorry we have to disappoint so many people, because I'm sure there's lots of questions, and I think we could devote one whole day to this topic. So I'd like to thank our two speakers, Mary McGillicuddy and Finbar Moore, and we have learned a lot, and it has stimulated lots more interest, especially I think in the interactive new technology where you can bing on the wreck and find out more. So lots to explore during the winter. So I'd like to thank them again and thank yourselves for your participation. And Mary O'Connor now will just explain the arrangements about lunch. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, everyone. Some small housekeeping rules for lunch, because we have such a wonderful and large crowd. We're going to start. We allow the people in the marquee will stay in the marquee, and Deirdre will look after the lunch there, so you don't have to move. We're going to say the people in the AV room, if you proceed to the tea rooms, they will look after you first, because we're very conscious of where you're sitting, and the people in the chapel, we're going to provide you with a tour, and then you will proceed for lunch. So there has to be perks with every position. We're also delighted that the OPW have gone to the trouble of displaying the mask which you saw this morning in the exhibition room upstairs, which was very, very kind of them to make that arrangement so promptly this morning. Geraldine is delighted. And just for you all to enjoy lunch, and we'll give you a 10-minute warning for coming back. So one actually other small point, if there's anybody that's leaving the chapel and not returning to the afternoon session, if you would just give your little chapel stickers to Gabrielle, who's at the front here, because we'd like other people to come into the chapel for the afternoon session. So enjoy lunch, everyone, and thank you.